12 years. In around 6 months, we will have waited 12 years for George R. R. Martin to release The Winds of Winter. A lot of people have given up at this point, but today I want to look at one key factor in the delay of Book 6 and maybe find an answer to the question, is it still worth waiting for The Winds of Winter? There's definitely a multitude of reasons as to why the book is not out yet. Whether it be the massive amount of side projects George has been working on, helping develop Game of Thrones successor shows or co-executive producing adaptations of some of his previous works, or just the sheer size of the novel, which is going to be the biggest one so far. There's one key factor that always got my attention when Martin gave updates about Book 6.
Like all the details in manuals and glossaries laid out then?
No, I have some of that, but much less than you would think. It's a much more organic process. I've often said that that writers are of two types. There is the architect, which is one type, and the architect, as with designing a building, lays out the entire novel ahead of time. Everything is there in the blueprint. And then there's the gardener who, digs a hole in the ground and puts in a seed and waters it with his blood, and he sees what comes up. No one is purely an architect. No one is purely a gardener in terms of writers, but many writers tend to one side or the other, and I'm very much more a gardener.
Well, I have always said that I believe there are two types of writers, which I call the architect and the gardener. The architect plans everything in advance. He draws up his blueprint. He knows where the plumbing is going to run. He knows how many rooms they're going to be, exactly what the square footage of each room is. Everything is finalized before you dig the hole in the ground or drive the first nail. The gardener, he may know the general shape of the garden that he wants, but still, he's digging a hole in the ground, he's planting a seed. And, he has some idea what's going to come up, the gardener. The gardener knows whether he's planted an oak tree or whether he's planted a radish. So it's not totally random, but, is the oak tree going to be a healthy oak tree? Is it going to be windblown? Is lightning going to strike it? There's a lot that goes to chance and to other elements with the gardener. The garden is a living thing. And I think it's the same for writers. I think all writers are a mixture of both. But some lean much more heavily to one side than to the other. And there's no doubt that I lean much more heavily to the gardener side.
So, there you have it. The story just became too big. It's just too much to untangle this time around. It's gotten too complex, even for a writer of George's magnitude. Or wait a minute, maybe it's the other way around actually. If George manages to push through, if he gets rid of a few point of view characters, and if he sets up the endgame, A Dream of Spring is going to be an action-packed book that will release much faster, just like A Storm of Swords. But then again, isn't that exactly what was supposed to happen after George split up A Dance with Dragons? Chaos. This is the exact same discussion that I've been seeing for years now. I think to a certain degree both arguments are fair in their own way. I finished reading the books for the first time right before season 5 of Game of Thrones started airing. That was in 2015, so I've only been waiting for around 7 years, but even I find myself getting more and more pessimistic about the book ever seeing the light of day. If you look at it from a story point of view, we have around 20 POV characters, and while George might have to kill some of them off, oddly enough we still get more with every book he releases. Just look at Barristan Selmy's debut in A Dance with Dragons. George famously had to deal with the Myronese knot and realized that he needed a new POV to tell the story. That is exactly the kind of risk a gardener takes in his storytelling. Who knows if George is able to deal with Winds of Winter's story without adding a new viewpoint character. Hell, A Dance with Dragons introduced a whole new contender for the Iron Throne in young Griff. I personally believe that he will sit the Iron Throne for at least a little while, but in order for that to happen, he has to deal with the Dornish, the Tyrells, the Faith Militant, Cersei and Grayscale. That's just one storyline with an incredible amount of what-ifs that doesn't even include magical aspects of this world. What is going on at Hardhome? What's the deal with Skagos? How and when is Jon Snow coming back to life, and how much will he have changed? What's Lady Stoneheart's purpose in the story? What about the Pink Letter? What's going on at Old Town with Jaqen H'ghar, Sarella Sand, Sam, and Euron Greyjoy's imminent attack? I could go on and on, but you get the idea. George made it very clear that he doesn't intend to introduce new point of view characters, except for the prologue and epilogue, of course. It's been years, however, and the garden definitely keeps on growing, so I really wouldn't count on that. Let's look at one of George's latest updates from the 8th of July last year. My stories grow and evolve and change as I write them. I generally know where I'm going, sure. The final destinations, the big set pieces, they have been in my head for years, for decades in the case of A Song of Ice and Fire. I have been at work in my winter garden. Things are growing and changing, as does happen with us gardeners. Things twist, things change, new ideas come to me, old ideas prove unworkable. I write, I rewrite, I restructure, I rip everything apart and rewrite again. I go through doors that lead nowhere, and doors that open on marvels. Sounds mad, I know, but it's how I write. Always has been, always will be, for good or ill. What I have noticed more and more of late, however, is my gardening is taking me further and further away from the television series. Yes, some of the things you saw on HBO and Game of Thrones you will also see in The Winds of Winter, though maybe not in quite the same ways. But much of the rest will be quite different. Well, I guess at least there's that, right? I think it's fair to assume that George feels the immense amount of pressure surrounding Winds of Winter's release. While an architect could probably rely on outlines, his approach coupled with the backlash to the ending of Game of Thrones is probably just too much to handle. The garden is forced to grow in a satisfying way, instead of it being able to flourish naturally. That's only human. As I previously said, this is going to be the biggest book so far, according to George himself. So much so that George's own publishers pretty much begged him to split the book into 2 parts again. In my opinion, that doesn't really solve the problem. I live in Germany, and the novels are always split up into 2 volumes here, and maybe that might just be the best course of action for Winds. I think they should let George finish the book the way he wants, and then maybe split up the release. Otherwise we start right over, and George needs to move chapters to A Dream of Spring, which has not proven to be helpful or boost the process of Winds of Winter in any way. So, is it still worth waiting for the Winds of Winter? You can call me delusional, but I'm always gonna say yes. I think it also comes down to whether or not you are okay with the book series as a whole never being finished. And while I don't think it's ever going to happen, I kind of made my peace with that already. And I get the frustration behind that. We've all dedicated years, if not decades, to this series, to the characters, and as I said, I've only been waiting for Winds of Winter since 2015. There are people in this fandom who are invested in this world since 1996, right when A Game of Thrones came out. Me personally, however, I don't think I'll ever just be able to forget about this series or give up on it. I've never been this invested in characters and the story and just the entire world of it, really, because even if Martin never finishes the book series, even if Winds of Winter never comes out, which I still think it's gonna come out at some point, but A Dream of Spring, of course, is a whole nother topic. But even if that happens, even if he never finishes the book series, I still believe that it's gonna go down as one of the greatest pieces of fantasy that's ever been written. Sure, it definitely leaves a mark on George R. R. Martin's legacy as being one of the greatest. If he doesn't finish the story, there's always going to be that debate, and I understand it. Which brings me to a whole different thing, and that is television shows. So, of course, I'd hope that finishing this series remains his top priority. But I think he is also working towards a different thing, and that is this cinematic universe. I think he is laying the groundwork for this world to be around for decades, for a century. And I think that's also why he did write Fire and Blood, why he is considering writing Fire and Blood Part 2. That way you can make television shows out of it, you can tell different tales from this world, about the Targaryens and about a whole lot of other stuff as well. Again, whether or not that is your type of thing, whether you care about that or you don't at all, that's all up for debate. But to me personally, I'm always gonna be invested. I'm always up to read more about Westeros or to see more of Westeros in TV at HBO, or I think there's also just so much opportunity to do movies. If you take, for example, House of the Dragon, there's a time period afterwards where Alice Rivers rules over Harrenhal, just a tiny section there, could be explored in a movie, and I'm not a fan of overblowing it the way Marvel and Star Wars does it. I hope the quality of it is always gonna come first. Is it still worth waiting for Winds of Winter? Is it still worth it to be invested in this? At the end of the day, we will see where this all goes. And I hope Winds of Winter does come out at one point. I don't know if it's gonna be the full thing or if it gets split up again like A Dance with Dragons. But then again, the story is so big that you kind of have to ask yourself if it's even possible to finish the series within these next 2 books, within Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring, but that might be a topic for another video. Please let me know down below, do you still care? Have you just given up at this point? And what do you think about the legacy of George R.R. Martin if Winds of Winter, if A Dream of Spring never see the light of day? Let's have a discussion about it. Thank you for watching, take care, and see us later.